with my friend Ramon, who is a news junkie, and we are just going to go through some stories ranging from tech censorship to transgender antics and more. So before we went live, we were talking about the straight pride flag. Is that what was being discussed before this went live?
Yeah, apparently there's this new trend that Pink News is mad about, which is called the super straight gender identity. And I'll try to pull up a story and then send it to you in the chat because it doesn't make sense otherwise. But this Asian guy on TikTok made this very cheeky video. Not He wasn't even being serious in my opinion, but he was saying that there's a new gender identity which is super straight, which is in order to avoid having to
I saw that
date
actually.
transgenders. Yeah, here, I'll send it to you. And
I saw.
yeah, like Pink News decided, you know what? There's no such thing as bait in the world, right? So we're just going to, I guess, believe whatever they're telling us. Can you still hear me? My computer just froze up.
Yeah, I can hear you. It got choppy, but I can still hear you.
Yeah, one sec. Okay, so yeah, so I just sent it to you in the chat.
Okay.
And it's just like obviously like TikTok. It's not that long of a video, and he uses some sort of very circular logic to justify it, which, you know, for all I care, yeah, let's have another pride flag, but this time for people who are tired of pride flags, I guess.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. It's like this. This is kind of like esoteric to obscure chat forums like 4chan, but it's like the argument of like, are traps gay?
Right.
It's kind
Yeah.
of what this reminds me of, like these like esoteric arguments of like if or whether or not traps are gay. It's because it's something like 50%, like 50% of the time you're attracted to straight people or something like that. I don't know, but there's actually another story that I think is not funny. It's actually pretty gross, and it is this dude named Alok Manon, and he's like a contributor he's like a HuffPost shit poster, and this is apparently an actual quote that is being promoted by Women's Voices, which looks like just a kind of like news aggregator, or maybe it's an actual website. No, this is actually a person who just decided to name her Twitter Women's Voices. She's a contributor to Feminist Current, and this just seems. I stand with J.K. Rowling. Okay, okay, she gave voice to this thing, Alok Vide Manon, and I'm being harsh, but I think that this person actually warrants mockery. So this is a real quote. The narrative is that transgender people will come into bathrooms and abuse little girls. The supposed purity of the victims has remained stagnant. So it's like, okay, where is this argument going? This alleged purity of little girls? Like, okay, there are no princesses. Little girls are also kinky. Your kids aren't as straight and narrow as you think. So basically, this man who writes for HuffPost and all these other pretty big publications is arguing in so many words that uh, actually your little girls are like whores, like little girls are sluts, or like kind of like little girls can be sluts too. Yes, yes. Uh, and so what came to mind when I saw this was there's this clip of Potato Man, Brian Stelter, and he says like in his high pitched voice, like conservatives complain about cancel culture, but it's really consequence culture. And I hate to say it, but Brian Stelter is actually right. Or I should say that I'm actually not against something like consequence culture in principle. I think that when the people that are holding the machinery of government and its social cultural power are on the left, and they can cancel you, make you feel the consequences, in other words, of the things you say and do, I think that's a position that we're in now, and that's not a good position because basically, like, up is down, uh, good is bad. Like that's the reality of like left wing hegemony, we'll call it. But in principle, I don't think that I kind of view it, I guess, as like a firearm. I think it's a neutral thing. And so, in my perfect world, consequence culture would come for this person. Like, this person would not be able to write for any publication that's respectable. Like, they would not be on TV. They would be canceled, in other words. And for whatever reason, that's where my mind went. Like, I don't think that this person should have a platform. Like, I don't think that, because clearly this person is like an activist and they have been elevated to the status of trans activist and writer. Like, you actually shouldn't be employed if this is the kind of smut that you're trying to normalize. What do you think? And I don't care if you agree with me or disagree with me, but that's my position on this.
Well, I think it's a little different from the like I saw what Brian Stelter said about consequence culture, and it relates to the release. I think it's a firing of Lou Dobbs.
Right.
I think he very much abuses what he's trying to say, because
Of
what you're
course.
talking about
Yes.
is, social standards. There's always in every
Yes.
society there is sort of a baseline, and sometimes it's axiomatic. In probably 99% of cultures, it's axiomatic that you don't exploit children for sexual desires.
Yep.
Even in the cultures where that does happen, it's sort of like a class division. Like, they'll usually use like the poorest of society. So then you could even look at it as a classist, um, you know, exploitation of the weakest of society, like the weakest both in class and in ability, because they're children. So people trying to do this, like what they're trying to do, it's certainly something that's been in process for many years. In fact, I know we've both written for American Greatness. This was a story I wrote in July, where I was looking into some of the stuff that's not censored by the internet, and I came upon this, what they portray as sort of Wikipedia, but for people who are minor attracted person, right? Who are pedophiles, right? I don't know if you remember that. I don't know, but
No, but I just love the euphemisms. Minor attract, like child
exactly.
adjacent.
So you're you're
Yeah.
you're trying all the time to take the charge out of the concept, when in every generation, people do try to justify stuff that does erode that basic standard, right? Just like
Yeah.
for many centuries, there were people in Europe who said, well, we don't really believe in slavery because of the gospel and everything. That the Catholic Church did issue a papal bull that allowed for that type of slavery, and then actual chattel slavery happened. This is the same idea, that you want to do something that socially is wrong. And I think that I don't want to call it consequence culture. I want to call it just the maintenance of the most fundamental.
Social hygiene.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's the maintenance of a real social responsibility that is
Yeah.
probably like protecting the innocent children, whoever it is. I think is one of the reasons that I think I am pro-life, and I don't even have a religious reason for it. I just believe
Right.
that a fetus is a patient. Likewise, I think children, they don't have the capability to make decisions like that at an early age, and it's
Right.
just it boils their blood seeing people talk about things like this.
Yeah. No, it's totally predatory because children are vulnerable. They're confused. They're figuring things out. So when you tell them that thought that you're having or that impulse you're having, it's actually something that's repressed, and I'm going to help you liberate it. And of course, I get nothing out of this. I'm just, good old Alok, just your friendly neighborhood, extremely masculine trans activist writer. He has more hair than I do.
Right, and
Um,
and and the other thing you reminded me of earlier is that when I was writing that story, it reminded me there is a movie. I think it's from 1993, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called Chicken Hawk. It's made by NYU grad student at the time, or no, I think he was just an undergrad student who was taking a film class, and it's one of the most chilling documentaries you'll ever see because he went and started to interview people from NAMBLA and sort of
Oof.
get into their head, what the hell are you doing? And
If you don't
they
know, NAMBLA is the National Association for Manboy Love,
North
I think.
American, well, yeah, same idea, yeah, that's what they're
Yeah, yeah,
called. But
right,
it was chilling because the problem is sometimes you get a documentary where the subjects let their guard down so much that they think that they can trust the person filming them, and they were so comfortable it was like ridiculous. They were like, this is
right.
our chance to actually explain to people why we're so normal. But the way they behaved, the way that they would look at the camera, the way that they would refer to children was so just eerie that I think you
Yeah,
cannot help but walk away from that and say this organization has to be
destroyed.
mitigated. Something, yeah. You can't
Yeah,
have this
yeah,
functioning.
yeah. Um, no, I think that's actually a good way to look at. I mean, this is the argument that I've been saying, but there's something about that concept of moral hygiene that's ultimately what something like cancel culture or consequence culture properly understood actually is. Like, you're just policing boundaries of acceptable behavior. And of course, when, like I said in the beginning, under a woke hegemony like we have today, the concept is abused. And basically, I mean, in a way, these people are enforcing their morality, their ethical framework on society. They're canceling people who subscribe to the old way of thinking and doing things, and they're kind of pathologizing it. Actually, if you're opposed to this, if you're opposed to what Allah has said, it's because you're bigoted. So, and you're suffering from either some kind of repressed, like maybe you are actually trans yourself, and it's repressed, and that's why you are so angry about this, or that you're suffering from some kind of a pathological thing, and that explains your irrational rejection of this brave new world. And so, at the same time that that's being pathologized and culturally canceled, a new system, a new worldview is being constructed, and one in which this kind of thing is normalized. So, I mean, ultimately, it is a kind of way of policing boundaries, of enforcing social and moral hygiene. The other story that I think is interesting, and you brought this up to me, was one about, let's change the configuration here to cinematic view. So this is a story about Facebook being investigated for systemic racial bias in hiring. And when you first brought this story up to me, I thought this was a reference to a lawsuit that the federal government filed against Facebook in December, where it actually started with Project Veritas leaking video. Actually, not leaking video. Project Veritas got their hands on an internal memo at Facebook where there is this. It's actually considered a diversity initiative. Quote to the purpose of it is to fosters diversity by favoring visa workers H-1Bs over United States citizens. And so Project Veritas leaks the memo. The story is pretty big, or it should have been, anyways. Um, and that's basically it. Facebook has systemically been passing over qualified candidates who are U.S. citizens, regardless of race, and instead giving the job to visa workers. And they do this like deliberately, systematically, to the point where they're actually willing to, it seems like, incur like they're willing to lose money over this. I don't know how else to put it. It seems like Facebook is actually willing to sacrifice like efficiency in company operations just so that they can hire visa workers. Like in this story, it's noted that in some cases, like for like long periods of time, positions just don't get filled because Facebook will pass over people until they get to a visa worker. And why? Okay, on the surface, it's because they're fostering diversity and inclusion, but in reality, anyone who really knows about the legal immigration system and visa workers and specifically, is that visa workers are pliable. Their employment and their stay in the United States, more importantly, is contingent on their employer. So if you're here on a visa, you want to get out of wherever you, wherever country you came from, like India, maybe you dream of someday turning that visa into a green card, and the H-1B, it's called a dual intent visa, so you actually can get a green card uh, through like a few twists and turns. You're going to keep your mouth shut. Like you're going to put up with abusive bosses. You're going to get paid what you get paid, and you're not going to complain. And you also don't have the same kind of access to legal recourse that U.S. citizens might have. So, in other words, the diversity initiative that Facebook has is actually about labor exploitation. It's just labor exploitation by another name. But the story that you brought up is one about Facebook getting they're being investigated for systemic racial bias for passing over candidates who are mostly black. It seems like so. This says the people that are that want to issue like a lawsuit against Facebook have alleged Facebook discriminates against black candidates and employees by relying on subjective evaluations and promoting stereotypes. So on the one hand, out of hand, you can kind of say this is kind of funny. Facebook is having like the woke thing blow up in their face, like they can't please the woke crowd. But the other way to look at this is maybe some of these like black US citizens that got passed over for hiring got passed over because Facebook wanted to give their job to a visa worker. So it's a kind of interesting dynamic. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it hinges on a little issue that I remember coming up during a similar lawsuit that a number of black employees filed against CNN. And the reason I think it's a little different from diversity lawsuits is because in CNN's case, they're located in what city? Atlanta, which is the largest metropolis in the South. It's also one of the fastest growing black communities in the country. But there's a lot of crippling poverty in that community there. And you could make the case that whatever, I don't know whether the discrimination was true or not at CNN. I don't know what became of the lawsuits. It was a class action lawsuit, but they should live and die by the sword of the community that they belong to, right? If CNN is committed to Atlanta as a community. So my question would be, what location were these Facebook employees specifically applying to, or was this company wide across the country? And who would be the driving force behind the lawsuit? Because you have seen this is a problem I think that hurt the cause of civil rights in the black community deeply in the 80s and 90s when Jesse Jackson started to file suit against Texaco and against Anheuser-Busch. And the goal was never to promote the well-being of the black community as a whole, middle class and working class people. It was to get jobs and distributorships in Anheuser-Busch's case for his cronies. And in his case, I think one of his sons got an Anheuser-Busch distributorship. So you sort of have to gauge who is the driving force behind the lawsuit and then what's the ultimate goal. Because, people can easily be convinced that they're being the target of discrimination.
Right.
But sometimes they are. It's just a fact.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's why there's layers to this story, and it's difficult to pull them apart because on the one hand, this does kind of seem like just the latest woke story in the news where you have black employees and presumably other POCs applicants who got passed over because they failed on what they consider subjective evaluations, which is the whole concept of like a subjective evaluation. Like, should Facebook have objective standards set by like an external community? It doesn't really make it's like, of course, an employer is going to have subjective preferences in hiring. Like, it's like, well, I'm applying to Facebook and I'm really good at welding. It's like, well, great, but we need people that are good at like at this specific skill or something. Just it's kind of funny. Just these are people that are upset basically that they didn't make the cut, possibly. But again, it could also be that ironically these were people that got passed over because Facebook wanted to give their jobs to visa workers. Um, so, but is this going to result in any kind of real change? No, I don't think so. I think the whole notion of like go woke, go broke, I haven't seen no proof of that actually bearing out and being true. Like Twitter took a pretty substantial financial loss, it seems, by kicking Trump off their platform, and they're still willing to do it. Like they kicked Trump off their platform, which I think somebody estimated that cost Twitter millions of dollars. And then you had Angela Merkel and the president of Mexico both state publicly this is deeply disturbing. We're not comfortable with this. Twitter still won't allow Trump back on. They actually doubled down and said we will never allow back on the platform, even if he runs for office in the future. So they're willing to take losses, and I think companies like Facebook are too. I think because they're just so big that they can absorb these losses, and so it's like I think for most conservatives, the take might be like, well, Facebook is finally going to, realize that going woke doesn't pay. Actually, Facebook's big enough that they can probably just institute some kind of like BLM hiring quota and then call it good and just make up for the losses. Like they don't care. So, but anyways, I think the story is it's interesting for a number of reasons. You brought something to my attention that I was not aware of, and that is that there is something going on with the president's war powers possibly being curtailed by Congress.
Well,
What was that?
I wanted to say about the previous topic first.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So you're saying that the whole get woke go broke thing is not, it's not a truism, and I think it really depends on the industry because, like you said, Twitter initially they lost $5 billion in market capitalization, but
there you go. Yeah.
eventually, like I think within 2 weeks they recovered it, and now they're actually double their share price from when it started because, they've started to look out at, they've started to. By the way, this is important for both of us. They've bought a rival of Substack, so they're trying to branch out into things like that. So I think, personally, I'm more of a libertarian than you are. I think, however, Twitter sort of stretches the real logical conclusion of libertarianism because we believe in the NAP. What Twitter does, I think, violates every type of the NAP. They're hosting people who are, sex predators. That's violating the NAP.
Sex pests. Yeah.
So I'm not going to just. So I think both of us can see where there has to be something done about this corporation. But what can the individual do? I think I personally do try to stop using mainstream tech. Maybe one day one of these platforms will be, powerful enough to be a significant force. It hasn't happened yet. It'll take a lot of work, and I think it might not happen for the next 5 years or so, but there are institutions like that, like some of these sports and entertainment fields that are destroying their market. The Hollywood and the Golden Globes have a serious problem on their hands, so that's not the entire industry, but they're certainly making it harder for themselves by promoting a product that people don't buy.
Yeah. Well, I think at a certain point, go woke, the broke woke framework doesn't make sense. I think maybe a small business, like I live in a small town in Ohio. If a small business went woke here, it would probably collapse. It would be, like people just wouldn't patronize it anymore. But I think when we are talking about this issue of like companies going woke, we're talking about Twitter, Facebook. We're talking about these huge corporations that are important because they basically stop being corporations at a certain point because of the amount of political force that they're able to exert over American life through lobbying and things like that. Another example is Nike. Like after Nike hired Kaepernick, I think they posted some pretty substantial losses. They probably have recovered that, but but before that happened, a spokesperson for Nike said, "We're fine with taking losses in the short term because we don't think that old white men will be our key demographic going forward." And that's like how a lot of these companies think. They're willing to take the hit in the short term, and they can absorb it. And there's a lot of examples of that. I think, like you pointed out, Hollywood is a great example of that. So is the NFL, which I think viewership is pretty low, isn't it?
The NFL
I
has
guess for
suffered, and even more so than the NFL, the ESPN has suffered a lot because people will tune into a football game even with like political slogans printed on the field. They can tune it out, but what ESPN started to do was create sports punditry on TV. Even when I was a kid, they were starting to do it. They had pretty woke reporters even at the time that were claiming that
right,
one of them had a book that was called $40 Million Slaves about NBA players claiming that. And I had to actually, it was a textbook in college for a class I took called Diversity in Sports.
where'd you go
So
to school?
I went to Cleveland State. So
Okay, that makes
um,
sense.
right. So and I was sitting in the class there. It was a class that was curated for NCAA athletes, and I was one of the few people that found it in the catalog and was not an athlete, as you can probably see from my from my image. But anyway, like you could see a lot of these athletes, whether it was a black athletes or it was a Bosnian guy, they were like, a lot of this is just like demagoguery. Like who cares. And
Right.
that's basically what ESPN has peddled. People like James Roden, who wrote that
Yeah.
book, who they believe it's so unfair the way sports is, even though a lot of these athletes are living like unbelievable lifestyles, and
Yep.
it's sort of I mean, people know that their life has changed since Jackie Robinson and Roberto Clemente, and I remember Hideo Nomo being the first Japanese player in baseball. So just in baseball, stuff's changed dramatically all the time. And when they see this type of stuff being used as just a cudgel to hurt something that they enjoy, they really do tune it out. So ESPN has suffered tremendously, and it's also not just because of the politics; it's because people are turning away from cable TV in general because of just streaming and things like that. So absolutely, I think it just depends on the industry. And like you said, some of these corporations are so big and so influential, and some of them even earn dramatically um, you know, inflated government contracts like Amazon and who else? The Amazon and I believe even Facebook have earned massive contracts from the Department of Defense. So I don't think it's
Right.
just an issue that it's inside the corporation. It's beyond saying
Yeah.
laissez-faire at this point because
Yeah.
they're involved in
Yeah.
the way this country's governed.
Right. Yeah. At a certain point, we're not talking about the small businesses. We're not like the free market ceases to exist, and you're talking about a leviathan that fuses industry and government together. And that's not crony capitalism either. This is something different, I think, than I think this is something. Some libertarians get this. I think the Mises guys are good at this. Like they seem to understand what managerialism is in this post capitalist regime that we all live in now. Um, but I think that a lot of conservatives and quite a few libertarians don't. They still think that that America is more or less like a capitalist society, and that any problems in the system can be labeled as crony capitalism. In other words, a kind of glitch in an otherwise good system. But I would argue that what they're describing is the system itself. It's just a moment of clarity, like you're just actually seeing how things really work in this country, uh, which is that's the rule, not the exception. But anyways, that's a digression. So this is the war powers story. If you wanted to talk about this for a bit,
Well, I think what happened was when Biden ordered that airstrike in late February against a militia in Syria. I believe it was a pro-Iranian militia.
right?
A lot of these Democrats in Congress started to wake up and say, he might start to actually do damage that we'll have to be accountable for. And some of the people who are involved are, believe it or not, Tim Kaine, who says that there's no, we have to sort of rein it in. So the senators proposed the measure amid bipartisan anger over Biden's decision to launch retaliatory airstrikes against Iran-backed militia groups in Syria last week without first seeking congressional approval. Now I have kind of mixed feelings over this because I think it was a major problem when Congress delegated that to the executive branch back in 2001. They started to, the war on terror. I lived through it as a high school sophomore, and my views have evolved as I've gotten older, and I've known people. I didn't serve in the U.S. Army. My parents are Israeli citizens, so I served over there, and I realized really that decisions that are made in bunkers elsewhere, they do affect real people. And you have to really be careful because it's somebody else's children who are serving on that front. And there's also other people's children who are facing them on the other side. And I think, it was the worst mistake of the conservative movement at the time to embrace the war on terror and say, well, we need to fight them over there, or else they're going to fight them over here, because there was actually a bulletin over the weekend. It is from the Free Beacon, so take it for what it's worth. I don't always believe them. That they said that Iranian militia groups have claimed that they do have agents here in D.C. and in across the country. So if you believe that to be true, then you're also fighting them over there and you're fighting them over here, meaning that you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So I do believe that it's a positive step, believe it or not, by Congress. But it's one of the few bipartisan ideas that I think could have some potential, because we don't need another conflict when we're still embroiled in Afghanistan. We still have, by the way, we also have, I believe we have troops deployed in other Central Asian republics, in Uzbekistan, for example.
Yeah.
And, my awakening to politics actually happened in 2008 when Ron Paul started to say, hey, do you know that we have troops still stationed in Italy? Do you know that we have troops stationed in several nations in Southeast Asia that you probably couldn't
Africa.
find on a map? That was sort of a big wake up moment for me. And I think that, it's long overdue. Maybe they're doing it for the wrong reasons, but I think it might be a positive step for once.
Yeah, it's interesting. Um, so Biden got obviously and rightly a lot of flack for this drone strike, and it was entertaining watching the media kind of justify and rationalize how it's different when Biden bombs people in the Middle East than when Trump does it. And I don't know which outlet, but it was a major outlet like Washington Post or MSNBC. But there was a journo on Twitter who remarked how nice it was that when Biden does a drone strike, he doesn't brag about it, and that it doesn't turn into like a big public spectacle, like with Trump, where he brags about killing Soleimani and stuff. And basically, uh, they're happy with the continuation of drone strikes, but they just basically want to not be as apprised of them, and they appreciate it when the president doesn't brag about them as much. It just this like the most brain dead. Like, I can't believe that you have like a pretty large salary and are considered a professional, and you have a brain like this kind of takes. Um, Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the attitude of media towards War and Peace has sort of eroded in terms of its sophistication for many many years. Because I mean, a couple months ago I did write an article concerning the death of the anti-war Democrat. So back in the 70s, even though there was a Democrat who was running it was a Democratic administration that got us into Vietnam. It was the Kennedy/Johnson administration. There were people on the left who started to say, hey, this we don't know what the hell's going on here. We're talking about body counts that are inflated. Seymour Hersh, who is by no means a conservative, he exposed the My Lai massacre. He exposed, I think he was involved in exposing Agent Orange. I might be wrong, which affected U.S. troops as well. and there were just a lot of issues with the way the U.S. was conducting the war that were inhumane. Period. Whether you're talking about our soldiers, or the combatants, and B, they were not ultimately going to lead to successful victory against the North Vietnamese. And unfortunately, throughout the years, the media started to attach the label of the war party only to the Republicans and ignore the fact that the Democrats are willing,
Yeah.
what do you call it? Willing co-conspirators in some cases, or
Um,
accomplices to many of these, military adventures overseas. And it's pretty
yeah.
difficult to get through to some of these people. I actually explained to a guy who's a good friend that, when we were going into Iraq and Bush was going into Iraq, you were all against it, right? You thought it was ridiculous. And he was like, yeah, of course. And I said, well, don't you think that it's wrong for us to be going into Syria right now, and based on faulty intelligence about chemical weapons
Right.
attacks and everything? This was when Trump was happening, and this guy hated Trump, hated the very soul of him. And he said, no, I think this time we should be going in. I'm like, are you out of your mind? So you hate
Right.
everything about this guy. You think he's this disgusting tyrant. You think he's a sexual predator, but you think in this case he's doing the right thing, going and bombing a country that, um, before the evidence is presented,
Yeah.
and he just couldn't explain it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's excuse me. I think it is it has become a kind of fixture of the American political psyche on the left and the right. And last night there was this debate. It was called "What is the Future of Conservatism?" And it was a debate between Dana McCarthy, Charles Cook, Heather Mangu Ward, and Ross Douthat. And I think that was it. And uh, this was a theme that was repeated throughout the night. Was basically a kind of the United States has a kind of moral obligation to invade the world and make it safe for democracy. And it's remarkable how all of these supposedly highly intelligent individuals who are free thinkers and very discerning, would just kind of unthinkingly pay just uh, kowtow to this idea that no matter what changes in American political life, we have to continue this project of building democracy, and that if we can't import 3 million immigrants a year and um, give them prosperity that we all enjoy, it's like kind of like I feel guilty about that, and so the least we can do is invade their country and drone strike them and build democracy so that they can have a chance at prosperity someday. It's the most insane, psychotic thing ever. This idea of you have two choices: either you invade the world or you invite the world, and that's it. And if you don't subscribe to either of those concepts, well, you're not a real blood. You're not a real red-blooded American. It's like bizarre to me. Uh, it's bizarre until I think you accept that it's kind of like um, a quasi-religious sentiment. It maybe the conversation you had with your friend kind of made that apparent. It's like they can't really explain to you. It comes from a place of irrationality. This is just right. I feel it like, this is just something that we need to do, man. And we're kind of morally obligated to do this. It's Trump wasn't a whole lot better at this, by the way.
Yeah, he
I,
was
I
he
I
was
really,
bad at it. Yeah.
yeah, and I really think that one of the only reasons we didn't get into a war with Iran was because of Tucker Carlson. If you recall, when Trump was threatening to strategically bomb cultural sites in the Middle East to kind of scare the Iranians, or to punish them, I should say. One, I was livid. I thought that was fucking psychotic. That is what America is going to be remembered for, doing exactly what ISIS did. ISIS targeted sites like Palmyra because they knew that these sites are priceless. They are outposts of Western civilization. And here's the Trump administration saying we're going to do the same thing. And what happened is for like 2 or 3 nights in a row, you had Tucker Carlson just blasting the Trump administration. And then Trump de-escalated with Iran. And around that time that was happening, there was reports published in a few different outlets saying that Trump's decision to de-escalate, that Tucker's monologues and his criticisms of the administration factored into Trump's decision to de-escalate. Because at that time, anyways, Trump considered Tucker a kind of like pulse for the base, what they were willing to tolerate. And I mean, of course, there's the fact that drone strikes accelerated under Trump. Like we had actually more drone strikes under him than Obama in terms of, I guess, like first term. And also, it became more difficult to, I guess, determine how many civilians were being killed by our drone strikes.
Yeah, they changed the way that the reporting was done. I remember that.
It became less transparent, in other words. Yeah. So, no, you're totally right. This is a kind of uniparty thing. Doesn't matter who's in office. You're either going to get drone strikes with a MAGA hat, or you're going to get drone strikes with an LGBTQ sticker slapped on the Predator. Like, it's disappointing. So.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to make the case. I do have a little bit of a military background, but it's certainly not enough to make me an authority. But I think once you get to know really you can always read. There's plenty of literature around about the price of these military adventures. We ruined some Latin American countries, that way. Part of the reason that Central America, the Nicaragua and Honduras are so dysfunctional is because the U.S. was involved there in the early 20th century. And, maybe they wouldn't be model societies now if we wouldn't have been involved. But I think the more we get involved in these theaters overseas, it just becomes sort of reminiscent of the way that the Roman Empire began to crumble because it just became overstretched. You have to start depending on troop populations that include people who are poorer. In some cases, we have people serving in the military that are trying to get their immigration through it. Their immigration status straightened out through it. That does happen. People forget about that. So it's in my opinion, it's very unethical, but it also will long term contribute to a decline of the U.S. Geopolitically, and it did happen, in recent memory with the British and French empires that they had these massive dependencies overseas, like Algeria and French Indochina and Malaya in Britain's case, where they sacrificed a lot of troops in order to safeguard them, and ultimately they gave them up anyway. So you just have to. People don't think long term, and I think the U.S. military is certainly just, there's just a stick in the mud with that, and this whole support the troops thing is way too dogmatic, in my opinion. If you support the troops, you want them to be a little safer and out of harm's way, and also not to be using those good old greenbacks.
Yeah, well, no, I tend to agree, at least on the part of the military and the kind of cult that has arisen around it, which I think is natural. Most societies will revere their military at some point or another, or at least hold it in really high regard. But we are at this weird juncture where we still have this kind of post 9/11 military culture where you're not allowed to criticize the military because that's what terrorists do. And on the other hand, our military has become so transparently hostile to regular Americans. Like the Pentagon hates middle Americans.
Right. Yeah.
And that manifests as these woke initiatives in the military, whether they're gender based or race based. And I think the climax of that, or I guess the latest uh, peak of that has happened after the January 6th riots, where
Yeah,
now
I knew you were going
people in the
this way. Yeah.
military, yeah, people are being screened for their extremist views, which is insane because if you really, I mean, if you really think about it, it basically, uh, people like, it's difficult to draw these big generalizations, but like, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the people that voted for Trump because they love America and think America is good. Contra many Democrat voters who think America is like racist and there's still a lot of work to do. You know, it's not a bad place, but it could be better if we can just get over how racist everyone is. And like, so basically the Pentagon views like the Trump voter psyche as a problem. Uh, it's just like the most bizarre juncture of history where we're at right now, where the United States military is like overtly hostile to the kind of people that you would want in the military. And it just like totally disincentivizes the right kind of people joining the military. But instead, we incentivize people that want to get like sex change operations because now the military will pay for that. You want to go to college, the military will pay for that. You want to become a U.S. citizen, the military will pay for that. So it's like the military has become a Gibbs machine, but we've lost the the real purpose of the military, which is it's a civil institution, or it should be, but now it's like it's the opposite. Yeah, it's super bad timeline.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you want me to blackpill you any further, but
Do it. I can't be blackpilled.
so I think what's happening now in the U.S. military, I did see some of it. I mean, I was in a different military. I was in the Israeli Defense Forces, and that was happening there too, unfortunately, because because there was a big immigration influx over there. It was necessary too because we had a lot of troops who came from the Soviet Union and things like that, but they weren't necessarily treated better. They were just being instead of focusing on the real personnel problems in the military, like the sexual assault against female soldiers, they were making more, uh, professions within the military accessible to women. And then the women consequentially were being more vulnerable to sexual assault because they were being put next to a conscripted population. A lot of those people had criminal records or they'd had misdemeanors when they got into the military. It's the same idea in the U.S. The problem is that we have a culture that's become corrupt, sort of like the first topic we dealt with today with the whole, that person who's talking about kinky
Yeah.
kids or something. If the culture as a whole has really bizarre,
Yes.
temptations at the moment, the military will absorb it, and critical race theory and a lot of these other gender identities are no different from, let's say in Japan. Remember, why was Japan in World War II so aggressive? Because of a militarist culture throughout Japan, right? And it ended up being too much in the end because they bit off a little more than they can chew. Well, we're definitely chewing not just too much, but the wrong stuff with the military right now. Um, I just don't know what's going to happen in terms of that. I think that that's one of the reasons I do believe people need to, work on their own self-defense, whether it is, preparing your own house, your own gear, not to get too specific, your own, learning martial arts, things like that, because I don't think that the military or law enforcement is really the best friend that traditional Republican conservatism has taught people. You sort of have to be an independent person as far as that goes.
Yeah, I totally agree. The military is a reflection of the society it serves. And I actually wrote an article for the Washington Times. It was the one and only article I've written for the Times about this, about how uh, the rise in the number of gang members in the military who join to get training and maybe even equipment, and then they go out or they defect from the U.S. military and they rejoin their gang and they have training in communications. Apart from like obviously weapons training, they've also learned infantry tactics. They've learned communications, and they become more effective at organized crime. And on its face, that story I think struck many people as shocking and bizarre, but ultimately the military is just a reflection of the society that it serves. And so it's not surprising. It's still bizarre and disturbing, but it's not surprising that the military is going the way that it's going. Uh, so yeah, I think the stream is just a reflection of the bizarre society that we live in. We're at almost an hour. I think that's it. Do you have anything else for the night? Any other news stories that you want to talk about?
Just that it does look, I don't know when there's going to be betting pools on whether Cuomo will be impeached or whatever, because it's so hard to tell. But I
Yeah,
think that it's obvious they want him to voluntarily leave, but I don't know if it's going to happen.
right.
Um, but apart from that, on Wednesday, I am going to be interviewing an author on my YouTube channel, Bold Like a Leopard, live, Matt Palumbo, regarding Dumb and Dumber, the book, his latest book concerning Mayor de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo. So certainly going to talk about some of those civic and administrative issues that I think are important, regardless of if you're involved in politics or not. And that's about it. I can tell you where to find me, but that's about it.
Yeah, where can people find you?
So on Gab, I'm at Starscream 85 on Minds and most of the other platforms. I am at Chef Leopard, so that would be on Minds and on BitChute, as well as I think on Odyssey I'm Bold Like a Leopard as well. But I've largely eliminated Facebook and Twitter as any sort of venue for me. So check out those platforms.
How do you like Minds? I use Gab, and I think that between Parler and Gab has a better interface.
Gab is better, both on desktop. It's certainly better, but I really like Minds because you do have a lot of art on there, and there's also more functions for blogging and things like that if you want to do long form stuff. So I think you can do more with it. But Gab is starting to catch up in term. They started the Gab TV thing,
Yeah,
which maybe you want to check out.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I
Gab
recommend
is
them
great.
all.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining me, and you guys know where to find him. And I will see you in the next time. I'm sure I'll have you back on at some point. This has been a good talk. Thank you for and also for humoring me. As I'm still getting used to streaming and all that stuff. So yeah, I will see you guys in the next one.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and I'm glad to see how far you've come in term. I've people were mad at you for going on Tucker Carlson after the election, for going on Tucker
Right.
Carlson because they were mad at him. I was like,
Yeah.
you know, can't people like
Yeah.
disassociate one person from another? So yeah, it's always an honor and
No,
glad to talk to you.
they can't. Yeah. So it's likewise, man. If also Ray occasionally writes at American Greatness, so you can follow him there as well. Uh, the article that he wrote on the anti-war Democrat it's a long read, but it's worth your time. So go check it out at American Greatness.
All right,
Okay.
thanks a lot.
Good night, guys.
Good night.
Yep.